Hello and welcome to the Wheels of History podcast, Episode 8, The Frozen Chosin. This is Part 4 of our 5-part series on the Korean War. I'm your host, Brian Boyles. Last episode, we discussed the Chinese counterattack against Walker's 8th Army in the West, which ultimately led to the collapse of the ROK 2nd Corps and the decimation of the 2nd Infantry Division as they pulled back. The 8th Army would then break contact with the Chinese, abandon Pyongyang, and finally stop along the 38th parallel. The Chinese would catch up with them about 2 weeks later. While the Chinese' main effort was a raid against the 8th Army in the West, they devoted the 9th Army Group, consisting of 12 divisions, to cover their eastern flank. Here, in eastern North Korea, the U.S. Army 10th Corps operated as a force separate from the 8th Army. Originally, 10th Corps was the force that landed at Incheon in September 1950. As the 8th Army advanced north, MacArthur had the 10th Corps re-embark at Incheon and go to the other side of the peninsula and land at Wonsan, with the intent being that 10th Corps would advance west from Wonsan and 8th Army would advance north from Seoul, converging on Pyongyang. However, the collapse of the North Korean army led to Pyongyang falling before 10th Corps was even unloaded at Wonsan, so their mission changed to advancing north along the eastern coast of Korea and into the mountains up to the Yalu River. To do so, the ROK 1st Corps advanced up the coast, the 7th Infantry Division advanced north past the Chosin Reservoir to the Yalu, the 3rd Infantry Division defended their logistics base at the ports of Wonsan and Hungnam, and finally, the 1st Marine Division advanced north to the Chosin Reservoir to link up with the 8th Army near the Yalu River. Although this scheme of maneuver dispersed 10th Corps combat power across the vast area, the North Korean army had collapsed, resistance was negligible, and UN forces hadn't fought the Chinese in strength yet. The Chosin Reservoir sits on top of a high mountain plateau and is alongside a road that leads up from the 10th Corps supply hub at the port of Hungnam, continues past the Chosin Reservoir onto the Yalu River. Given the high Taebaek mountain range that runs up the Korean peninsula like a spine, it also was the only practical route for significant combat power to link up between 10th Corps and 8th Army. During the Chinese counteroffensive at the end of October, that initial short counterattack that lasted a week before the Chinese melted back into the hills, this happened at the same time that 10th Corps encountered their first Chinese soldiers as well. Here, the Chinese blocked ROK units advancing towards the Chosin Reservoir. When this happened, the 1st Marine Division advanced forward, dislodging the Chinese thanks to superior air power and artillery support. And, just as in the West, the Chinese disengaged on November 7th, and no further contact was made for weeks. On November 10th, the Marines made it to the Koto-ri Plateau, some 3,400 feet above where they had started their journey at Hungnam. This plateau is the plateau that the Chosin Reservoir is on. The night they arrived there, the temperature dropped from 40 degrees to 8 below zero, with a 30 to 35 mile per hour wind. The shock of the sudden temperature change inflicted 200 cold weather casualties that first night. However, the Marines advanced cautiously, reaching the south end of the Chosin Reservoir on the 14th of November and extending forces out to the western end of the reservoir by the 25th. Along the way, they encountered few Chinese soldiers, mostly undefended roadblocks and booby traps. Now let me describe in greater detail the geography of the area, because that plays a critical role in military operations. The Chosin Reservoir is 13 miles long north to south and 8 miles wide east to west. It's surrounded by hills and mountains with steep slopes, some of them rising several thousand feet above the reservoir. The hills have sparse foliage and some trees, and critically there are several areas of flat ground amidst the mountains and water, connected by narrow, winding roads. I'll start at Hungnam and work my way up to the reservoir. So there's a single road going from Hungnam to the Chosin Reservoir, and a critical terrain feature is the Funchilin Pass, where the road climbs 2,500 feet in 8 miles, most of it a narrow, single-lane road. The Marines garrison the foot of the pass at a place called Chinhongni. as well as the town at the top of the pass, Kotori, placing a battalion in each perimeter. The road continues from Kotori to Hagururi, which is a village at the southern tip of the reservoir. That road is 11 miles long, passing up a mountain valley a few hundred meters wide. And then at Hagururi, where the terrain opens up into kind of an open bowl, the road splits. One road goes up the east side of the reservoir, and the other road goes west. Hagururi is secured by a Marine battalion and has some artillery and logistics troops, and General O.P. Smith, commander of the 1st Marine Division, establishes his headquarters at Hagururi. East of the reservoir, the 5th Marine Regiment is initially deployed there and occupying some defensive positions, but these were later relieved by the Army's 31st Regimental Combat Team from the 7th Infantry Division. To the west of Hagururi, the road travels 14 miles through the mountains, climbing another 1,000 feet through the Toktong Pass, and then descends to Udamni on the western end of the Chosin Reservoir. The 5th and 7th Marine Regiments consolidated at Udamni, intent on attacking west to link up with the 8th Army. So there are these numerous isolated marine perimeters connected by single, narrow roads winding through the mountains. There are no bypasses to these roads unless you backtrack dozens of miles. General O.P. Smith is cautious and concerned about the extended, vulnerable supply lines, the mountainous terrain, and reports of Chinese forces in the hills around the reservoir. This brought him into conflict with the 10th Corps commander, Major General Ned Almond, who was pushing for a rapid advance to the border thanks to the urging from MacArthur to end the war decisively and quickly. Indeed, General Smith would have preferred to spend the winter consolidated at the Chosin Reservoir, or even better yet, back down at Hungnam. But, seeing the lack of enemy resistance since November 7th, Almond and MacArthur pressed for the advance to the border, so that's how you end up with the 1st Marine Division dispersed across and around the Chosin Reservoir at the eve of the Chinese counterattack. The majority of their combat power, 2 Marine regiments and about 2/3 of their artillery support, is at Udamni at the west end of the reservoir, preparing to attack west, while their 3rd Regiment, the 1st Marines, is spread out in battalion perimeters protecting key logistics hubs along the road back to Hungnam, Hagururi, Kotori, and then Chihungni at the bottom of the Funchulin Pass. And finally, you have the 31st Regimental Combat Team on the east side of the reservoir, prepared to attack north to the Yalu. The Chinese, for their part, have 12 divisions in the area under the 9th Army Group. Each Chinese division has an authorized strength of about 10,000 soldiers, but in practice, it's closer to 7,500 to 8,000 soldiers per division. Now, in contrast, the 1st Marine Division is a very large division, over 20,000 troops. The reason why the Chinese divisions are smaller is because they really don't have a lot of support assets that the Marines do. They have very limited artillery support, few vehicles, if any, really just some medium caliber mortars, and a lot of light infantry. However, the fact that they don't have much in the way of support assets or logistical support also means that of these 8,000 some odd soldiers in each division, the vast majority of them are actually frontline combat troops, whereas the U.S. divisions have much more in the support realm. So the 9th Army Group crossed into Korea from Manchuria in November. They relieved the earlier forces who had fought the ROKs in the 1st Marine Division at the beginning of November, and their mission was to protect the flank of the 4th Field Army, which was off in the west fighting the 8th Army. Their other mission is to attack and destroy the 1st Marine Division. To do this, they plan on infiltrating their forces into position, taking advantage of the mountainous terrain to remain undetected, and then cut the main supply route all the way from Udamni in the west to Chihungni at the Funchulin Pass, and everywhere in between, completely isolating each of the marine perimeters, and then to attack and destroy them. As late as November 26th, the 1st Marine Division remained largely unaware of the tens of thousands of Chinese troops around them. Sure, they knew the Chinese were out there somewhere, but they didn't know where or how strong they were. The 1st Marine Division intelligence estimate from the 26th of November reads, quote, "The only report supporting the probable presence of an unusually large number of enemy in the area originated with the local civilians. Their reports, based on past experience, were usually accurate as to position, but grossly exaggerated as to number. In addition, there was an absence, as of this time, of aggressive enemy patrolling, and a failure of both ground and aerial reconnaissance to reveal the presence of large enemy concentrations. Because the enemy had failed to defend the critical road junction and crucial terrain point of Udamni with any great amount of determination, it was felt that a general weakness in his defensive capability was indicated to the immediate front. At most, company-sized Chinese forces were encountered in the hills between Hagoruri and Udamni, but these were defeated, and the Marines seized Udamni on 25 November. We're now going to cover the combat actions at each perimeter as they happened the first nights of the Chinese counterattack. First at Udamni, then the 31st Regimental Combat Team east of Chosin, and finally at Hagoruri. 10th Corps' plan is to kick off their attack to the border on the 27th of November, with the 31st Regimental Combat Team advancing along the east side of the reservoir, 5th Marine Regiment advancing in the west. At Udamni, besides the 2 Marine regiments and the majority of the division artillery, there is also a lone M26 Pershing tank. And there's an interesting story behind why there's only a single tank out at Udamni. The original plan was to send M4 Sherman tanks to Udamni, but due to the treacherous roads, icy conditions, there were issues getting them over the mountains. So First Lieutenant Primrose, a platoon leader of the heavier M26 Pershing tanks, volunteered to see if he could get his tank to Udamni. He was successful, although for the sake of safety, it was only him and his driver that made the journey, and so he was transported by helicopter back to Hagoruri in order to bring the rest of his platoon the next day. However, as it would happen, the Chinese would cut the roads that night, and the crew is flown back out to their tank to fight at Udamni. On the 27th of November, the 5th Marines leads off their attack west of Udamni, but advances only a mile before encountering heavy Chinese resistance from the hills. The attack stalls, and the Marines quickly abandon the attack. Udamni itself is in an isolated section of flat ground and serves as a road hub with roads leading to the north, west, south, and southwest. It's surrounded by high mountain ridges on all sides except to the east where the reservoir is. The 7th Marines is providing perimeter security and are dug in along 5 ridges surrounding Udamni, those ridges rising about 1,000 feet above the village itself. On the 27th of November, General Almond arrives at Udamni by jeep to visit the front line and to encourage the troops at the start of the new offensive. He departs around 4:50 p.m. as evening came, and, fortunate for him, his vehicle is the last one out of Udamni before the Chinese cut the road. The Chinese have 2 divisions in the hills around Udamni, and they've been waiting for a week. When night falls on the 27th, they attack to the sound of bugles and horns. The Chinese launch frontal attacks, the 79th Division from the north and the 89th Division from the west and northwest. The Chinese advance to within a few hundred yards of the perimeter, silent and undetected, and then lob their grenades and start firing mortar shells, and finally charge the Marines. Repeated Chinese attacks hit over and over again, driving a wedge between 2 company perimeters and threatening to roll up the line if they manage to break through. Indeed, some troops actually do make it through to the battalion command post, but they are ultimately stopped. In the fighting, a machine gun sets fire to a thatched roof cottage that the Chinese are sheltering in, illuminating the area and revealing hundreds of Chinese soldiers preparing to attack. Over the course of an hour, the Marines wipe out this force due to the prolific use of artillery and ample automatic weapons fire. Elsewhere on the front, when a platoon collapsed after an hour of sustained attacks, the company commander, Captain Crook, smothers the area with artillery and mortar fire and then personally leads a counterattack. He's killed during the attack, but his second-in-command, Second Lieutenant James Mitchell, takes over and continues the counterattack, restoring the line. This holds for a few more hours until Chinese reinforcements attack around 3 in the morning, forcing the company off the summit over the space of a few hours. Now, Chinese attacks had little flexibility once they started. They were reliant on runners, whistles, bugles, and signal flares to communicate. They didn't have radios, and so the Chinese tactic was to continually attack a position over and over and over again, wearing it down until they could overrun it and send troops to the rear areas. Furthermore, if possible, they would try to envelop the position as well as attack it frontally, their main goal being to get into the rear areas, block resupply routes, and then cut off the main defensive positions, inducing them to withdraw. On the northern ridge, Captain Phillips from E Company 7th Marines is defending Hill 1282. His company weathers repeated attacks until eventually the Chinese break through. Captain Phillips sees the penetration, raises his rifle and stabs it, bayonet end first, into the snow, shouting, "We hold here!" Just after saying that, he's shot and killed. First Lieutenant Ball, already wounded, and firing his rifle at the enemy, takes command, but he is hit several more times in short order and dies. Ultimately, every officer in E Company would be killed or wounded by the morning, but the Marines bring in reinforcements of their own and retain control of the reverse slope of the hill. When dawn comes and C Company arrives to retake the hilltop, E Company has been reduced to only 20 survivors. Ultimately, the Chinese are unable to make a significant penetration in the Marine perimeter. They seized a few hilltops and pushed the Marines back here and there, but overall the Marine lines held and inflicted numerous casualties upon the Chinese. A large part of this success comes from the determined, courageous leadership, as evidenced by the high casualties amongst the leaders and them leading from the front. However, even though these frontal attacks failed to breach the perimeter, the Chinese also had their secondary plan of isolating each of the perimeters and cutting them off from resupply. They had sent forces into the rear areas through the mountains and occupied roadblocks all the way along the supply route between Udamni and Hagururi, between Hagururi down to Kotori, and Kotori down to Chihungni. Each of these perimeters is now isolated. The Chinese have placed over 50 roadblocks along this main supply route, their only supply route really. They destroyed the bridges, dug in positions along the hills overlooking the road, daring the Marines to try and break through or wither on the vine. This put the 1st Marine Division in the same spot that the 2nd Infantry Division was when they had run the gauntlet in the west. Now remember, the road between Udamni and Hagururi runs through the mountains on the south side of the reservoir, and one particularly critical choke point is the Toktong Pass. The Marines were cautious about the threat of Chinese soldiers and infiltrators, and so the Marines placed a reinforced rifle company, Fox Company, 7th Marine Regiment, in defensive positions around the Toktong Pass. These 240 men, with supporting machine guns and 81mm mortars, arrived in place on the 27th of November without opposition. They're put on an isolated hill just north of the road near the center of the pass. That very night, around 2:30 in the morning, on November 28th, the Chinese attacked Fox Company, catching their 3rd platoon completely by surprise and overrunning their forward squads. The platoon suffers nearly 75% casualties, but, now alerted, the neighboring platoons join the fight in a close-quarters grenade and small arms fight. The Chinese attack repeatedly. One Marine, Private Hector Cafarada, holds off multiple attacks with the fellow members of his fire team. One by one, his fellow team members are killed or wounded, but Cafarada continues fighting with grenades and his rifle, even picking up a Chinese grenade to throw it back, when it explodes moments after leaving his hand, wounding him. He continued to fight until a Chinese sniper incapacitated him, earning Cafarada a Congressional Medal of Honor. The Chinese also attack the company from the road itself, but are surprised by the resistance offered by the company headquarters and mortar section, which roll grenades down the hill, decimating the Chinese soldiers. Daylight comes, and Australian F-51 Mustangs arrive and bomb the Chinese north of Fox Company, forcing the Chinese to finally break off their attack. In this first night of attacks, some 450 Chinese bodies are counted, both inside and outside the perimeter. But Fox Company itself suffered 20 dead and 54 wounded, over 30% casualties. Most of these took place in the initial attack on 3rd Platoon. Fox Company is ordered to break out, but the company commander, Captain William Barber, realizes that it isn't practical given how many wounded Marines he has. In order to break out successfully, he would have to abandon them, and Marines don't leave their own. So instead, he decided to hold the perimeter and wait for relief. Airdrops of supply during the day help replenish their ammunition and provide some medical supplies, while artillery fire from Hagururi is registered on suspected enemy positions. As darkness comes, Captain Barber and his men prepare for another round of Chinese attacks. Alright, now we're going to shift over to the east side of the Chosin Reservoir, where a regiment from the 7th Infantry Division is preparing to attack north. Now originally, the east side of the reservoir was occupied by troops of the 5th Marine Regiment, but at the request of the 1st Marine Division commander, MacArthur directed that a regiment from the 7th Infantry Division would be attached to the 1st Marine Division in order to allow the 1st Marines to concentrate their forces on the attack west from Udamni. So these orders went out on the 24th of November and stipulated that the regiment had to be in place by noon on the 26th. The closest 7th Infantry Division forces were some 100 miles away by road, much of it narrow, single-lane roads winding its way through the mountains. And so, in order to meet the deadline, the closest 7th ID elements are assigned under the 31st Regimental Combat Team headquarters, led by Colonel Alan McLean, and they're sent as quickly as possible. By the 26th, some 2 infantry battalions, 132 and 231 infantry, a tank company with 22 M4 Sherman tanks, an artillery battalion, and 8 self-propelled anti-aircraft guns occupy the Marine positions on the east side of the reservoir. The 3rd Infantry Battalion is still en route. Furthest north is 132 Infantry, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Faith, and they're occupying positions about 11 miles north of Hagaruri. His force is smaller than the Marine force they relieved, but given that their plan is to attack the next day and Chinese opposition had been non-existent, the southern side of the perimeter is left undefended. The other infantry battalion, 231 Infantry, is situated at a crossroads near an inlet in the reservoir, some 3 miles away. The artillery and anti-aircraft guns are located just south of this perimeter in their own assembly area. And finally, the tank company and regimental headquarters are located a few miles further south. Intelligence is limited. The Marines during their handover had said that they had sent out patrols for 10 miles in the surrounding area, but hadn't encountered any enemy. After occupying their positions, Colonel McLean received reports of a couple hundred Chinese somewhere east of the reservoir, and so he directs the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon to investigate down the road leading east from the inlet along a stream. Ominously, the platoon vanishes without a trace. That night, the same night the Marines at Udamni are attacked, the men of the 31st Regimental Combat Team hear scattered rifle fire around the perimeter. Initially, Lieutenant Colonel Faith dismisses it as scared Katusas firing at sounds in the night, a relatively common occurrence. But in reality, these are Chinese probing attacks leading up to their main assault that lands shortly after midnight. They attack Lieutenant Colonel Faith's perimeter first along the road leading to the north, and then they maneuver to the west to try and find gaps in the platoon battle positions. The TAC-P forward air controller, a man named Captain Edward Stamford, wakes up in his bunker with his team of 4 and hears voices outside. Chinese voices. Suddenly, a Chinese soldier pulls back the poncho covering the entrance to the bunker. Captain Stamford fires at the Chinese soldier and wounds him, but not before a Chinese grenade is thrown into the bunker, and in the resulting explosion, Captain Stamford, surprisingly, is unhurt, though 2 of his fellow team members are wounded. Outside the bunker, the company commander is killed by the Chinese, and so Captain Stamford, being the ranking officer on the scene, takes charge. Captain Stamford was originally a Marine enlisted pilot who earned his commission, flew in anti-submarine warfare and dive bomber units in World War II, and then attended the Marine Air Infantry School at Quantico. So, while he was not an infantryman by trade, he is no stranger to the life of a grunt. Captain Stamford quickly assesses the situation and realizes that the Chinese only penetrated a single platoon position, though in doing so they overran the 60mm mortars and the company command post. He orders the neighboring platoons to close the gap, and then gathers some men and begins searching for Chinese soldiers who had made it through the perimeter, either killing or repelling them. He then solidifies the defense, tells the men to hold in place and to conserve their ammunition. In retrospect, Captain Stamford thinks the initial Chinese success was more due to a lack of vigilance than any inherent weakness in their positions. Over the course of the night, the Chinese are mostly held back, with the exception of the Chinese taking the high ground on the east side of the perimeter, a hilltop which overlooks the rest of the battalion's positions. When daylight comes, Captain Stamford is relieved as company commander so he can focus on his duties as a forward air controller, which he promptly puts to good use by directing 4 Corsairs and their rockets, napalm, and 20mm cannon fire against the Chinese. While this happened, 331 infantry at the inlet were also attacked. This is where the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon disappeared the previous day. The Chinese attack from the east, along that road where the INR platoon disappeared, hitting 331 infantry hard around 1 in the morning. They penetrate through the perimeter, overrun the battalion command post, and even make it as far as a 105mm artillery battery. 2 company command posts are overrun, and the battalion commander and his staff are assumed dead or captured. There's only one company command post that was not overrun, Captain Earl Jordan's M Company. Captain Jordan described the battle as, quote, "The first night it seemed to me to be just a continuing battle at very close range, sometimes hand-to-hand, grenades used in large number by the Chinese until dawn, when the remaining enemy withdrew. There was little room where one might assemble a group for a counterattack as such. It would seem to me to be more clearly stated as a close-range fight for individual positions." End quote. In the dawn, the U.S. troops regroup and counterattack, eventually retaking the battalion command post. They discover that their commander, Lieutenant Colonel Riley, is still alive, but unconscious and stripped of weapons and valuables, having been assumed dead by the Chinese. Apparently, he was looking out a window when the Chinese suddenly appeared at the command post. Several Chinese soldiers tried to climb through the window, and then the battalion commander shot them. In the fighting, Lieutenant Colonel Riley was wounded 3 times and passed out from a hand grenade concussion. Further south, where the 57th Field Artillery Battalion headquarters and the self-propelled anti-aircraft guns are at, they were also hit that night. Mortar fire started landing on their position, and under the light of illumination rounds, the soldiers there spotted a large column of Chinese soldiers marching in formation along the road towards their position. Captain McClymont, commander of the anti-aircraft guns, later recalled, quote, "I raised my field glasses. The M-19 crew were at their posts. I looked through the field glasses, and with their light-gathering ability, I could see movement on the side of the hill alongside the road leading back to Hagaruri. I focused the glasses until I could see that there was a column of soldiers marching in formation along the road, heading directly towards our position. They were about 200 yards from my command post and were closing on us. They would soon be on top of my 1st Platoon command post. Just then, some sort of illumination shell or mortar round went off, and we could see the column clearly. Dressed in dark winter clothes, quilted coats, and flapped caps, they were moving toward us. I ordered the M-19 commander to load his twin 40mm and open fire. The twin 40s crumped simultaneously, and the tracers leaped out. Immediately, the high explosive shells burst in the column of men, and I ordered fire at full automatic. In only seconds, there was no movement from the column." End quote. On later inspection, they found 80 dead Chinese soldiers along the road. As discussed in the previous episode, the M19 is a tracked, self-propelled anti-aircraft gun with dual 40mm guns, and the M16 is a quad 50 caliber anti-aircraft gun platform mounted on a half-track. Both of these were the most valuable weapons against the Chinese due to their high rate of fire and high angle of fire, permitting them to easily engage the enemy high up on the hillsides. The effect of the 40mm rounds were particularly devastating. The dual 40mm Bofors guns put out a combined rate of fire of 4 rounds per second. Each round itself weighed 2 pounds and carried an explosive charge equivalent to a hand grenade. So just imagine 4 hand grenades per second going off on an infantry column advancing down a road, and you can get the picture. These guns were essential in breaking up the Chinese attack, but the Chinese were still able to knock out one of the guns in the attack, as well as attack the battalion command post, killing the executive officer and wounding the battalion commander. When daylight dawned, the artillery and anti-aircraft guns moved north to consolidate with the rest of 331 infantry in a single perimeter at the inlet. As had happened to the Marines, the Chinese cut the road between Colonel Faith's battalion and 331 infantry, as well as between the inlet and the regimental headquarters further south. Colonel McLean, who was positioned in his forward command post with Colonel Faith's battalion, was unaware of how badly the Chinese attacks hit 331 at the inlet. He thinks that, with the assistance of Captain Drake's tank company and the 3rd Infantry Battalion expected to arrive later that day, they would have no issue in fighting back the Chinese and continuing the attack. During the day, Colonel Faith's men tried to retake the high ground on the east side of the perimeter, and at one point even the battalion sergeant major joins the fight, leading a charge with his pistol drawn, but to no avail. The battalion sergeant major is killed, and airstrikes and ground attacks are unable to dislodge the Chinese. The Corps commander, General Almond, flies out to Hagaruri to confer with Major General Smith, and then flies by helicopter to talk with Colonel McLean. In their discussions, General Almond and Colonel McLean are unconcerned about the situation General Ullman thinks that the Chinese he encountered were part of stragglers fleeing north, and Colonel McLean is sure that with the tank company and 3rd Battalion, they'll have no issue repelling the Chinese. However, the tank company is having trouble of their own. The Regimental Medical Company was en route to the inlet when it was ambushed by Chinese at Hill 1221, a strong point and key terrain feature on the road between the regimental headquarters and the inlet. At Hill 1221, the road climbs through the saddle between 1221 and a larger ridgeline running east, and then descends back to the reservoir to go to the inlet. Captain Drake heard about the Chinese roadblock from survivors of the medical company, but they don't have any precise information on the Chinese roadblock, and so he assembles some 17 tanks for the attack and is accompanied by Brigadier General Hodes, the Assistant Commanding General of the 7th Infantry Division. They attack without infantry support simply because there are no infantrymen present. At a bend in the road near the saddle, the medical first sergeant asks them to stop so he can point out where the Chinese soldiers were last night. They stop, and as he is speaking, a single shot rings out and kills the first sergeant. General Hodes takes cover, and Captain Drake runs to his command tank. The tanks advance, encountering the burnt-out vehicles from the medical company. However, Chinese bazooka teams engage them and knock out the 2 lead tanks. The next platoon in line tries to flank to the east, but swarms of Chinese soldiers emerge from their fighting positions and climb on the tanks to try and open the engine hatches and disable the tanks with grenades. In typical tanker fashion, Captain Drake orders the other tanks to scratch their backs, a reference to shooting machine guns at your own tanks to kill infantrymen that are climbing on them. This forces the Chinese off the tanks, but 2 of the tanks got stuck in the soft ground. The 3rd platoon tries to flank to the west, but as they climb the hill, they have trouble gaining traction on the frozen ground, and one tank throws a track and the other slides down out of control. Captain Drake and Brigadier General Hodes confer, and they realize that their tanks won't be able to break through and withdraw, leaving their 4 tanks behind. This shows the challenges of using tanks in restricted terrain without infantry support. Tanks have a lot of firepower and protection, but visibility is limited, especially when you're buttoned up, that is, when the hatches are closed, and even more so when you're on restricted terrain, such as the hillside or soft ground where tanks can get stuck, which limits how much the tanks can maneuver and gives more opportunities for infantry to hide and sneak up on tanks at close quarters. In particular, tanks have very little visibility immediately around the tank itself. That night, the 28th to 29th of November, the Chinese attack again, and much as in the first night, they start with probing attacks around midnight, and then the main assault kicks off about an hour later. At Lieutenant Colonel Faith's position, the Chinese again penetrate through a platoon position, but are, once again, contained and pushed back. The Chinese also attack from the east, from the high ground they had occupied during the day, but again, they're held back, thanks to some machine guns and a recoilless rifle repositioned in response to the attack. Colonel McLean, though, reassesses the situation and decides at 2 a.m. that the battalion needs to withdraw and consolidate at the inlet with the rest of his forces. He knows they'll have to fight their way out and plans to do so, moving out at 4:30 in the morning before dawn to catch the Chinese by surprise. It's only 4 miles by road, and the infantrymen are ordered to take the high ground along the road with the vehicles carrying the wounded and operating under blackout conditions. Any vehicles or supplies left behind are not destroyed in order to maintain the element of surprise. In all, about 60 vehicles form a convoy, and the only troops left behind is a single platoon from A Company that was cut off from the perimeter earlier in the night. American forces were unable to break through to them, and so abandoned them. They make it to the inlet without serious opposition. As they approach the inlet, the men can see the Chinese engaging the troops there. Captain Bigger, the heavy weapons company commander, said, quote, "As our battalion command group arrived on the north side of the inlet, we could look across the ice and see that the 3rd Battalion, 31st Infantry, and 57th Field Artillery were heavily engaged. The Chinese were pouring down the surrounding hills toward the perimeter of the units. The quad 50 machine guns and the dual 40mm anti-aircraft weapons of the 57th FA were taking a heavy toll of the Chinese columns. It was like being a spectator at a large-screen movie for a moment. It was about this time that we observed a column of troops approaching the perimeter of the 31st from the south along the road." End quote. Colonel McLean sees this column of troops approaching and thinks they are 231 Infantry, that 3rd Battalion of troops he had been expecting to arrive at any time. and he was concerned a huge fratricide incident was about to ensue. He gives Colonel Faith some instructions, and then Colonel McLean strides out onto the ice floes in the inlet. He comes under fire and falls several times, but continues to cross. At the other end of the bank, he meets the column of troops, and then is quickly captured because they're Chinese soldiers, not Americans. From POW accounts, it's later learned that he died from wounds 4 days later, as he and other American prisoners of war were marched north from the reservoir. As the ranking officer, Colonel Faith takes charge of the force and consolidates the perimeter. The force then becomes unofficially named Task Force Faith. Now, the geography at the inlet is not favorable. To the west lies the inlet of the reservoir. To the south is Hill 1456, rising some 500 feet above the inlet and forming part of the ridgeline to the south. North is Hill 1324, and east is the river valley on the road from which the Chinese have been repeatedly attacking the perimeter the past 2 nights. On all sides, the Chinese hold the high ground. Colonel Faith tries to seize some high ground to the south of the perimeter with 2 companies, but they fail. And meanwhile, Captain Drake's tank company tries to break through again during the daylight, but again they lack infantry support, though this time they did have some soldiers on the ground, namely 60 men from logistics troops, the engineer company, and the headquarters. But the Chinese infantry are dug in well on Hill 1221, and they continue to block the road. The tanks have trouble climbing the hill slopes, and there is no air or artillery support available. The makeshift infantry force suffers heavy casualties, but at least no more tanks are lost. During the day, some supplies are paradropped by C-47s along the inlet, but in general, Task Force Faith is low on ammunition, especially 40mm ammunition for the anti-aircraft guns. Ironically, 40mm ammunition is airdropped to the regiment, but at the regimental headquarters at Hudangni, where there aren't any 40mm anti-aircraft guns. We're going to take a break from Task Force Faith for a little bit, and we'll shift to the final Marine perimeter to get attacked in that initial onslaught. And this one is the most crucial, Hagaruri. Hagaruri is a village located at the southern tip of the reservoir, at a crossroads with a road leading west to the Marines at Udamni, north to the Army forces east of Chosin, and south along the only supply route to Kotori, and from there down to the docks at Hungnam. The Marines described the town as a partly demolished Klondike Gold Rush camp, lying in a frozen bowl-shaped area with mountains immediately to the east. The ground is relatively flat for a few miles to the west before encountering the mountains that lie between Hagaruri and Udamni. A single, understrength Marine battalion is defending the perimeter. Now, this area is intended to become a major logistics and command and control hub, with the 1st Marine Division headquarters set up here, and with the engineers hard at work hacking an airfield out of the frozen ground. Core policy was to establish small airstrips capable of handling L-5 or L-19 liaison planes, which only needed about 500 feet of runway to take off and land. General Smith, though, has his engineers making a much larger airfield, some 3,200 feet long, capable of handling C-47s. Now, landing cargo planes is much more efficient than airdrops, both in terms of quantity of supply, accuracy, it avoids damage of the cargo itself landing, and it gives you the advantage of being able to evacuate wounded soldiers or fly other equipment out. However, the airfield is still under construction when the Chinese attack, only 25% complete, though the engineers are working around the clock using floodlights and headlights to continue their work at night. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Ridge, the Marine Battalion commander defending the perimeter, thinks that he really would need 2 regiments to properly defend Hagaruri, but given the limited troops at his disposal, creates a thinly held 4-mile perimeter, and in some cases parts of the perimeter are only manned with observation posts to call in artillery fire if the enemy is spotted. Most of the perimeter would also be manned by headquarters and logistics troops, with his Marine infantry and tanks positioned along the most critical point, which he thinks is initially to the southwest. The night of 27 to 28 November, reports come in about the attacks on the Marines at Udamni and the Army soldiers east of Chosin, but no one attacks Hagaruri. Of course, the Chinese did cut all the roads leading to and from Hagaruri, destroying the bridges and placing log roadblocks and the like. So Colonel Ridge dispatched a ROC lieutenant who was adept at intelligence gathering and who could also speak English, along with some other Korean agents, to go outside the perimeter and try and make contact with the Chinese forces. They report back that there are Chinese south and west of Hagaruri, and they even managed to talk to some of the soldiers who said they were going to be attacking and seizing Hagaruri that very night. Colonel Ridge was well versed in Chinese communist tactics from studying the Chinese Civil War, and he knew that their typical plan was to assemble 5 to 6 miles away to minimize the chance of discovery and limit vulnerability to artillery fire during the daytime. Then they would use the cover of darkness for their attack. Based on this information, he assumed the Chinese would attack probably around 21:30, and so he puts his forces on high alert. Digging in is difficult since the first 8 inches of the ground are frozen solid, and many of the Marines end up having to place explosives in ration cans to help break up the ground. Night falls, and with it, snow. The Chinese begin their attack at 22:30 to 3 signal flares, followed by 3 whistle blasts, then mortar fire, and finally the probing attacks begin. Despite heavy losses from the Marine automatic weapons, many Chinese soldiers reach the Marine foxholes. Some of them do manage to penetrate the perimeter and reach the airstrip and open fire on the bulldozers. But the Chinese attack falters, in part because a lot of the Chinese soldiers are distracted by looting the tents for food and clothing, which gives the Marines a chance to regroup. After 5 hours of grueling fighting, the Chinese fall back, leaving 750 dead Chinese in their wake and gutting the attacking regiment. After 5 hours of grueling fighting, the Chinese fall back, leaving 750 dead Chinese in their wake. They had only launched a single regiment in the attack out of the 3 regiments available to the Chinese, and we don't know exactly why they didn't attack in greater strength. But thankfully for the Marines, this single regimental attack was defeated handily and significantly degraded the Chinese combat power available against Hagaruri. On the east side of the perimeter rises the hill the Marines aptly came to call East Hill, and that lies just on the north side of the road to Kodori. It's lightly defended with an engineer company, some Korean laborers, and a signal platoon, some 81 Americans and 90 Katusas. They're attacked the same night the Marines are hit on the south side of the perimeter, and here the Chinese penetrate through the Korean labor platoon and begin rolling up the engineer company's flank. The front line cracks and bends as the engineers aren't prepared for a close quarters fight at night, and many of their rifles jam. However, the line doesn't break, and the company survives the night with 50% casualties. In the morning, they find some 400 dead Chinese outside their perimeter. Though the Chinese did gain the crest of East Hill, Lieutenant Colonel Ridge decides he has to counterattack to try and retake it, because control of the hill controls the roads coming in and out of Hagaruri. He assembles a force of 315 men from any unit available, clerks, typists, truck drivers, and stragglers, and they attack with Marine air cover, bringing napalm and bombs to the fight. However, enemy fire and the difficult terrain disrupts the attacking force. Only 75 make it to the military crest of the hill, the military crest being the area just below the hilltop itself. They are able to force the Chinese off the crest, but in turn are unable to dislodge the Chinese from the reverse slope of the hill. Between the 2 attacks, the Marines had taken over 500 casualties, but thankfully the Chinese are unable to exploit their gains. In particular, the Chinese were unable to commit major forces to the attack on East Hill, namely because most of their forces in the east were still tied up surrounding and attacking Task Force Faith. The Marines were fortunate. If both Chinese divisions had attacked in full strength, as the Chinese commanders had envisioned, Hagaruri would have likely fallen, and with it, the 1st Marine Division. Over the following days, the Marines assessed their situation. Thankfully, the Chinese don't continue to press the Marines at Udamni, namely due to the heavy casualties they had sustained the first night, but the Marines realized that the 14 miles of road between Udamni and Hagaruri had been thoroughly blocked by the Chinese. The only section of the road still under Marine control was at the critical Toktong Pass, where Fox Company occupied their defensive perimeter. The Marines tried to reopen the road 3 times from Udamni, but fail. The Marines are employing 5 helicopters to airlift casualties from Udamni to Hagaruri, though these are still the primitive helicopters of the 1950s that can only carry 2 stretchers attached to the outside of the helicopter. From Hagaruri, the casualties are airlifted back to Hungnam with the L-5 liaison planes, though those can only carry a single passenger. So throughput is very limited, though about 70 tons of supplies a day are dropped by parachute over the Marine perimeter. which increases to 250 tons a day by the first week of December. The Chinese in turn realize that they have failed to collapse the marine perimeters by frontal assault, and so they dispatch 2 more divisions from Manchuria to join the fight, though it will take several days for them to arrive. In the meantime, though, the Chinese still sit astride their supply routes and prevent the Marines from opening it, effectively besieging the Marine and Army perimeters. General Smith realizes how critical Hagaruri is to the Marines' survival, both as a central location where he can consolidate combat power from Udamni and the Army Regiment to the east, but more importantly, once the airstrip is complete and can land C-47s, it gives him a place where he can evacuate casualties and bring in enough supplies to fight his way back to friendly lines. Therefore, he notifies Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, commander of the 1st Marine Regiment, to send reinforcements from Kotori to Hagaruri. A scratch force is formed, called Task Force Drysdale, around a company of British commandos, an Army Infantry Company, a Marine Company, and a Tank Company. Both the commandos and the Army Company are reinforced, bringing the total number of troops to 922 with 141 vehicles, including 17 tanks. The road from Kotori to Hagaruri runs north for 11 miles through a valley in the mountains. Task Force Drysdale objective is to force their way to Hagaruri and reinforce the garrison. The column advances about 2.5 miles north, seizing 2 key hills alongside the route to enable their column to pass through, but they're unable to dislodge the Chinese from the 3rd hill, halting the column. Lieutenant Colonel Drysdale, the British officer in charge of the task force, decides to spearhead the attack with the tanks, followed by the motorized infantry. But again, the advance is halted shortly thereafter at a blown bridge, with Chinese positions overlooking the obstacle. The M26 tanks open fire at the houses that the Chinese are holed up in, destroying them and causing the Chinese to flee into the open where they're cut down by machine guns. And after some time, the force finds a bypass for the bridge and presses on, but there are many delays as the tanks encounter enemy positions or roadblocks. Then the infantry have to deploy, the enemy positions are cleared, the roadblock removed, and then finally they can remount and continue the advance. By 1600 hours, some 4 hours after the column departs, the task force has only made 4 miles north. Casualties mount, and the column has gotten disorganized as the units start intermingling with themselves. Many trucks have a mix of commandos, Marines, and Army soldiers in it, in a large part due to having to frequently remount while under fire. Colonel Drysdale thinks that it is advisable to pull back to Kotori, but General Smith orders them to push through. Their reinforcements are desperately needed at Hagaruri, and Smith knows that if Hagaruri falls, the division will likely fall with it. They advance north through a defile that will come to be known as Hellfire Valley. In this valley, a lucky Chinese mortar round destroys a truck in the middle of the column, splitting it. The soldiers are unable to clear the truck from the road due to heavy Chinese fire, which leaves the Army Infantry Company, half the commandos, and the service troops stuck in Hellfire Valley. Meanwhile, the forward part of the column continues to advance, unaware of the split, and they make it to the Marine perimeter at Hagaruri that evening at 1950 hours. These men, particularly the 16 surviving tanks, are a welcome addition to the defenses. However, back in the valley, the situation has gone from bad to worse. Mortars hit a second truck in the column, this one full of mortar rounds, and it begins cooking off, further splitting up the convoy. At this point in the valley, the floor is about 500 meters wide, and the Chinese infantry began closing in on the flanks of the column and engaged the UN troops in a close-range firefight. With the units so intermixed, local leaders take charge of whatever groups they can find. There's a belated attempt by the rear of the column to turn around and return to Kotori, but the Chinese block the road behind the troops and continue to attack and divide the column into smaller and smaller perimeters. Machine guns sweep the stalled vehicles, adding to the carnage. A second force from Kotori with 10 tanks and 15 trucks advanced later in the day, trying to link up with Task Force Drysdale, but they are blocked by the Chinese who had reoccupied some of the hills cleared earlier in the day. This second column is itself split by the Chinese, with the lead element and a tank platoon continuing to advance. This platoon, under fire by the Chinese, decides to go into a defensive coil and hold out during the night with the help of extensive artillery support. This platoon halted only half a mile south of Hellfire Valley, but they never made radio contact with the column, nor realized that the stranded troops were so close. The following morning, the tanks, still unaware of Task Force Drysdale just to their north, returned south to Kotori. Meanwhile, in Hellfire Valley, the Chinese stop trying to destroy the trucks, likely so they can loot the supplies. They know they have the UN troops in a bad position and are in no hurry to press their attacks or assault the column directly. The Chinese approach the northernmost pocket at 2 in the morning and demand their surrender at 4:30. Major McLaughlin, the ranking officer among the besieged troops, tries to delay in the hopes of holding out until daylight. However, at 4:30, the Chinese demand their surrender in 10 minutes or they will resume their attacks. Major McLaughlin checks on their ammunition supplies and realizes most soldiers are completely out of ammunition or have less than 8 rounds remaining, so he and the 130 soldiers with him surrender. Further south, another section of the column under the command of Major Seeley hears of the surrender and knows the Chinese will soon mass on his position. He decides to try and escape and leads his men across the Shangjing River, dragging or carrying the wounded up the steep mountains to the west. They make it back to Coterie after a 5-hour grueling trek through the mountains. While this is going on, the Army soldiers in Task Force Faith are enduring their own form of hell. The Chinese attack the perimeter at the inlet for the 3rd night in a row. This time, the attack is coming from the hills to the south, as well as infiltration along the shore of the reservoir along the inlet. The Americans hold the line, though their forces are continuing to degrade as casualties mount and key weapon systems are disabled. As a sign of the harsh weather and deteriorating conditions, an American soldier freezes to death in his foxhole that night. The Chinese also attack the perimeter from the north, but the M16 and M19 anti-aircraft guns break up the attack with their rapid-fire weapons, cutting huge gaps in the Chinese lines. The Chinese focus their attacks on taking out the M16s and M19s, immobilizing one and destroying an ammo trailer of another one with mortars, but the American firepower inflicts heavy casualties on the Chinese, and those anti-aircraft guns likely save the perimeter that night. When daylight comes, Captain Stanford, essentially the task force's lifeline with his ability to talk to the aircraft, calls in C-47s to bring in more ammunition. They make some supply drops, but there are no 40mm rounds for the M19s. Major General Barr, the 7th Infantry Division commanding general, and informs Colonel Faith that his task force is under the command of the 1st Marine Division and that 10th Corps had ordered a withdrawal to Hungnam to consolidate. When General Barr leaves, Colonel Faith is once again alone. The task force has no direct communication with the 1st Marine Division due to radio limitations, range, and the terrain. Captain Stanford's radio is the only way to talk to the outside world. At noon, though, Captain Stanford's radio stops working. The only alternative they can think of is to recover the 3rd Battalion's TAC-P radio. Their TAC-P died on the first night when the perimeter was overrun. But there's only one issue. It's located 500 meters away in enemy territory. Corporal Myron Smith and PFC Billy Johnson volunteer to recover it, and they succeed. And after 4 hours of working on the radio with bare hands in freezing weather, they finally get it working again. The Chinese, though, are getting bolder. They began attacking the western end of the perimeter in the afternoon. Thankfully, though, Colonel Faith reinforced this position with drivers, cooks, and other headquarters personnel, and they repelled the Chinese attacks, inflicting heavy casualties on the Chinese with few losses of their own. General Smith is ordered to devote a regiment to attack and link up with the 31st RCT and bring them back to Hagaluri, but he doesn't have the troops to spare. There are barely enough Marines to man the perimeter of Hagaluri itself, and the bulk of the 1st Marine Division's combat power is still bottled up at Udamni. General Smith thinks the only viable option is for Task Force Faith to try and break out and join them at Hagaluri, and he wants to devote as much air support as possible to assist them. Meanwhile, Captain Drake's tank company and the 31st Infantry Regiment's rear command post is ordered to withdraw to Hagaluri, which, in concert with the Marine Engineer Company, also withdrawn to the perimeter, bolsters the defenses by an additional 400 men and 16 tanks. These men and tanks, along with the forces from Task Force Drysdale, come just in time to stop a renewed Chinese attack from East Hill and inflicts heavy casualties on the Chinese. Back at the inlet, the 4th night of Chinese attacks hammers Task Force Faith as they seize a knoll in the northeast corner of the perimeter, which overlooks the rest of the task force. This further reduces the amount of space that the task force has to survive in, and then the battalion aid station is hit by a mortar round, wounding the battalion surgeon and other medical personnel. This doesn't make too much of a difference, though, because all their medical supplies are exhausted by dawn. Major Wesley Curtis of 1st Battalion S3 later said, quote, "In an attempt to describe accurately the scene inside the perimeter of Task Force Faith on the morning of 1st December 1950 runs the risk of appearing macabre. Very probably, however, even Hollywood will not be able to duplicate it in stark tragedy and horror. By dawn on 1 December, members of the task force had been under attack for 80 hours in subzero weather. None had slept much. None had washed or shaved. None had eaten more than a bare minimum. Due to the season of the year, darkness covered about 16 hours of each 24-hour period, and during the hours of darkness, the enemy exploited his terror weapons such as bugles, whistles, flares, burp guns, and infiltration tactics. The ground was frozen so solidly as to hamper digging, so riflemen and weapon crews occupied very shallow trenches. The dead, concentrated in central collecting points, had to be used as a source for all supplies, including clothing, weapons, and ammunition. Everyone seemed wounded in one fashion or another, and to varying degrees of severity. Frozen feet and hands were common. The wounded, who were unable to move about, froze to death. Trucks and jeeps and trailers were ransacked for ammunition and any kind of fabric that would serve for bandages or clothing. But the factors that discouraged and disheartened were these. Everyone could see that the weather was growing worse, which meant the loss of air support and aerial resupply. That relief from Hagaluri in any force less than regimental size could never reach us, that another night of determined attacks would surely overrun the position." End quote. Initially, the soldiers tried to dig graves for the dead along the inlet, but frozen ground, Chinese threats, and exhaustion quickly led the men to abandon these efforts and just stack the dead in rows, about 4 high, not far from a bridge over the stream. Around 0900, a lone Marine aircraft appears over the inlet, and Captain Stanford makes radio contact. The pilot tells Captain Stanford that he'll try and guide a flight of Corsairs to their position around noon, if the weather permitted. Lieutenant Colonel Faith tells Stanford to ask for heavy air support during the day and that they would attempt to break out. However, note the communications architecture here. Lieutenant Colonel Faith is telling Captain Stanford to tell the Marine pilot to tell the 1st Marine Air Wing dispatcher at Hagaluri that they need air support for the breakout. Again, Captain Stanford and his radio are the only way Task Force Faith has to communicate with the outside world, and that's a lot of weight to put on his shoulders. At 1000, Colonel Faith calls a conference with his commanders and staff and informs them that, on his own initiative, they are going to break out. The weather was currently overcast, but based on their conversations with the Marine pilot, it was expected to improve by noon. There is very little ammunition left, especially for the M16 and M19 anti-aircraft guns. The 1st Battalion would lead the fight, clearing the road and flanks for the passage of the truck column. The Artillery Battalion and Mortar Company would expend their ammunition, destroy their weapons, and fight as riflemen in the column. The 3rd Battalion would follow as a rear guard. Any inoperable trucks would be destroyed. Cargo would be unloaded from the operational trucks in order to make room for the wounded, and anything they couldn't carry out with them would be destroyed. Only 1 M19 and 2 M16s are available for the column. The rest are either immobilized or wouldn't start in the weather. Fuel is drained from the inoperable vehicles, and even after scavenging ammunition, some men only have a single clip of 8 rounds for the rifle. While this is going on, the Chinese are on the hills, watching the perimeter and seeing everything. The Chinese move reinforcements to the road in anticipation of their breakout, and increase their shelling of the perimeter, adding further wounded to the task force. The column is ready at 11. The only thing missing is air support. The weather finally begins to improve when the first aircraft start appearing at 1300. They have 4 hours until sunset. Captain Stanford is near the front of the column to direct airstrikes, and shortly after they begin moving, they come under fire, not just from defensive positions that the Chinese are in, but many Chinese soldiers start emerging from the hills and attacking the column outright. Captain Stanford calls in the Corsairs. The lead aircraft's napalm strike lands short and inflicts some friendly casualties, but it hits the Chinese harder. The Corsairs then return with 20mm cannon fire that rakes the Chinese forces. The short drop wounds about 10 Americans, and their fellow soldiers are horrified by the impact of the napalm. First Sergeant Luna of B Company, 1st Battalion, said, quote, You could see them running all around, just ripping their clothes off. Just keep on running." End quote. But the panic is stemmed when Colonel Faith rallies them, exhorting them with pistol drawn to keep pressing forward. Major Crosby Miller, the commander of the lead battalion, said, quote, "I feel like Captain Stanford's cool control of our aircraft, in which he directed the dropping of napalm not more than 40 yards to our front, started the Chinese on the run and allowed the 1st Battalion to inflict tremendous casualties on the enemy in our initial follow-up." End quote. A Marine pilot in the air later said that Captain Stanford was, quote, "calling for closer and closer support to less than 50 feet. The pilots could observe people practically clubbing the Reds off the trucks." End quote. General Smith provided Task Force Faith with as much air support as he could muster. Flights of 4 or 6 aircraft circled overhead throughout the afternoon and then conducted handoffs to follow-on flights, giving those craft a chance to refuel, rearm, and return. These aircraft were the only thing keeping the task force alive, and it gave the Americans enough breathing space to advance. However, the column made slow progress, averaging about 1 mile per hour. If they had abandoned the vehicles and the wounded, they could have gone much faster, but that wasn't the mission. Newly wounded soldiers are added to the trucks, though some are left behind. Small arms fire takes the toll of the truck drivers, and, since they're driving south down the road, most enemy fire is coming in from the driver's side of the vehicles, further increasing the danger. Few soldiers want to replace the wounded or dead drivers, which further delays the column. The infantry want to keep pushing ahead and drift from the flank protection of the road down to the road itself to speed their travel. It becomes increasingly difficult for the officers and NCOs to exercise control over the exhausted soldiers, compounded by many holes in the leadership and chain of command due to the casualties that have accumulated over the past 4 days. At 1500, the column reaches a valley and a stream at the foot of Hill 1221, that hill where Captain Drake's tanks failed to dislodge the Chinese in the previous days. The bridge there had been destroyed. The M19 leading the column fords the stream, but the truck following it gets stuck. So Major Miller orders the M19 to come back and tow the truck out, which it does, and repeats the process for nearly every vehicle in the column. It takes nearly 2 hours to get the convoy across the stream. Lieutenant Hugh May, the battalion transportation officer, fearlessly took charge of the bypass operation and directed the crossing site. He later wrote, quote, "The rear guard passed us and left the rear of the column exposed. I collected a few men and put them in the railroad cut to fire on the Chinese on the hill to our rear. I then returned to trying to get the last 2 trucks across the stream. After getting them across, one was knocked out by small arms fire and the driver of the other truck was killed. I unloaded the wounded who could walk and sent them ahead. With some help from the half-track crew, we transferred the remaining soldiers to another 2.5-ton nearby. One of the crew members from the half-track drove the truck out. There was so much happening at this time, and I was trying to do a little bit of everything at the rear of the column, trying to maintain some control and to keep things from getting completely out of hand. The 3rd Battalion, 31st Infantry, was assigned as the rear guard unit. At the time we were attempting to cross the last few vehicles at the blown bridge, we started to get an awful lot of enemy small arms fire from our rear and the high ground to our northeast. At this time I found the 3rd Battalion, 31st Infantry, were deserting their mission and were streaming past our position. There were some junior officers strung out among the troops and completely ignoring my plea to stop and start firing on the CCF. I did manage to get some troopers and a sergeant stopped and into a railroad cut and to build a base of fire on CCF to our rear and on the hill to our east. However, as soon as I returned to the job of getting the last vehicles over the bog and stream, these troops pulled out, up and over Hill 1221. End quote. The road south of the stream turns east, climbing the side of the hill. The stream is set in a valley running to the east. The rear guard initially occupied the high ground on the north side of the stream as the trucks were going through the bypass, but they didn't hold for long. Intelligence Sergeant Ivan Long recalled that after taking the North Ridge, the Chinese attacked his position in company strength. Quote, "The outfit I was with took to their heels, leaving me with only 2 men I could persuade to stay and face the attack. We were exhausted from fighting, but we fixed bayonets and took cover behind a wood pile in a farmyard. We got in a few good licks before my carbine jammed from snow and mud. We were all wounded and just overwhelmed by the onrushing Chinese." End quote. He would later escape from captivity that night and make his way back to Hagururi by walking over the ice of the frozen reservoir. Because the rear guard didn't hold the high ground north of the stream, the Chinese occupied those hills, giving them clear lines of fire on the entire convoy as they're trying to climb Hill 1221, inflicting heavy losses. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion attacks the Chinese roadblock in the saddle. Captain Stanford recounted, quote, 132 succeeded in forcing the roadblock, and it seemed they would go on, but they evidently ran into resistance and fell back. It looked as if they had lost their leaders. Their retirement looked like a rout. The enemy again occupied the roadblock and inflicted heavy casualties on 132 with rifle and machine gun fire, and was able to do the same to 331 on the slopes below the road, causing them to withdraw. End quote. The Americans continued to attack Hill 1221 throughout the night, no longer as a coherent force, but with officers or NCOs forming small parties from soldiers in the ditch to attack up the slope. Some succeeded, but in most cases they continued to move south over the hill and continuing on to Hagururi instead of clearing and holding the ground, enabling the convoy to pass. This in turn allowed the Chinese to reoccupy their old positions, and ironically, these positions the Chinese are in were actually originally dug by the 5th Marine Regiment some 10 days earlier. Anyways, Colonel Faith walks up and down the road trying to organize attacks on Hill 1221. He is mostly met with strong resistance to his efforts, but gradually these attacks go through and wear down the Chinese defenders. They succeed in securing the high ground on the hill, although they haven't cleared the roadblock in the saddle yet. In the darkness, Colonel Faith gathers some 300 soldiers that have made it over the top of the hill to attack the Chinese roadblock from the south. It's an uncoordinated attack. As Major Robert Jones of 1st Battalion S1 recalled, quote, we assaulted the roadblock by yelling, shouting, and making as much noise as possible. We received a few rounds of small arms fire, and then we were on the roadblock, which consisted of many logs piled across the roadway. We started to remove the logs. It was at about this point that we heard a voice demand who was making all the noise. I responded, and it was Colonel Faith. He made a comment and, along with the small party with him, moved along toward the truck column. End quote. Just a few minutes later, Lieutenant Colonel Faith is wounded by a Chinese grenade. However, his heroism and leadership in clearing the roadblock enables the convoy to begin moving again. Several of the trucks that had become knocked out while waiting along the valley are pushed over the side of the road to make way for those who can still drive. About 25 vehicles remain in the column, and they progress over the hill to a stream on the south side of Hill 1221. The bridge on that stream is damaged and is deemed unsuitable for vehicles to cross. So Lieutenant Hugh May, the transportation officer who directed the bypass earlier in the night, is leading a platoon of riflemen near the second stream. He's wary of a hill east of the road, a few hundred yards south, and warns some artillerymen from the 57th Field Artillery Battalion of the danger. However, as the artillerymen cross the railway trestle over the stream, the Chinese launch flares and open fire on them. First Lieutenant May decides discretion is the better part of valor and leads his men down the stream bed to the east, to the edge of the reservoir, and they follow the railroad tracks back to the marine perimeter at Hagururi. Captain Stanford, still with the vehicle column stuck at the second bridge, determines that there's a railway bridge west of the main road that's still intact. They drive a vehicle over the railway bridge to see if it's feasible, and it works, though it is slow going. Even though the trestle is only 25 feet long, the vehicles have to be ground-guided over it, one vehicle at a time, and the bumpy ride is painful for the wounded on board. They scream and moan as the trucks go over the railroad ties. Lieutenant Colonel Faith is in the cab of the lead truck. He's weak and is bleeding out from his wounds, and he can barely talk. However, despite the extreme pain, he tells Captain Stanford to continue on to Hagururi. About half a mile south of the stream, as Captain Stanford and several soldiers with him are walking down the road, shadows emerge from the roadside and disarm them. They're taken prisoner, but the convoy is close behind, and when that arrives, a firefight breaks out. The first truck runs the blockade, but the second is hit by a bazooka and is destroyed, blocking the way for the rest of the convoy. In the confusion, Captain Stanford makes a break for the reservoir, with Chinese soldiers in hot pursuit. He injures his ankle, but is able to evade capture and makes his way to the marine perimeter at 0225. With no effective rear guard and the convoy stalled, Chinese troops began swarming the rear of the convoy. Escotodamarung, with the Chinese throwing grenades at the trucks. One truck trying to run the roadblock is shot up and the driver killed, plowing into a ditch and further blocking the road. The truck behind it topples into a gully, rolling over and landing on its roof, to the screams of the wounded inside. The Chinese began pillaging the convoy, taking whatever supplies they can find, killing some and capturing others. Of the Americans, soldiers who are only lightly wounded often are able to escape across the reservoir to Hagururi. Throughout the night, stragglers would arrive at the Marine perimeter from the task force, and on the following days the Marines send out small patrols over the ice to rescue the wounded. In one case, they even attach a sled to a jeep to help recover them, and ultimately rescue 323 soldiers, all of them wounded and over half severely wounded. Lieutenant Colonel Olin Beale, the Marine 1st Motor Transport Battalion commander, personally led many of these patrols. He recounted, quote, "There were many brave men here this day, men shot through the body helping a buddy, men with hands frozen helping a buddy with a broken leg, men with both legs broken dragging themselves along with their hands and elbows." End quote. He even saw the remnants of the convoy, and, with the help of air support to keep the Chinese off his back, he combed the wreckage for survivors. Quote, "I went through that convoy and saw dead in each vehicle, stretchers piled up with men frozen to death trying to pull themselves out from under another stretcher. Yes, I saw this, and I shall never forget it." End quote. He estimates that some 300 were dead among the vehicles, but he didn't find anyone alive. There was only one truck that managed to run that last blockade. Lieutenant Colonel Faith, severely wounded and riding in the cab, was hit by small arms fire on the way through, and the truck driver, PFC Russell Barney, said that Lieutenant Colonel Faith was dead by the time the truck ran out of gas, some 2 miles further down the road. Lieutenant Colonel Faith was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor for his actions east of Chosin. His citation reads, quote, "Lieutenant Colonel Faith, commanding 1st Battalion, distinguished himself conspicuously by gallantry and intrepidity in action above and beyond the call of duty in the area of the Chosin Reservoir. When the enemy launched a fanatical attack against his battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Faith unhesitatingly exposed himself to heavy enemy fire as he moved about directing the action. When the enemy penetrated the positions, Lieutenant Colonel Faith personally led counterattacks to restore the position. During an attack by his battalion to effect a junction with another U.S. unit, Lieutenant Colonel Faith reconnoitered the route for and personally directed the first elements of his command across the ice-covered reservoir and then directed the movement of his vehicles, which were loaded with wounded, until all of his command had passed through the enemy fire. Having completed this, he crossed the reservoir himself. Assuming command of the force his unit had joined, he was given the mission of attacking to join friendly elements to the south. Lieutenant Colonel Faith, although physically exhausted in the bitter cold, organized and launched an attack which was soon stopped by enemy fire. He ran forward under enemy small arms and automatic weapons fire, got his men on their feet, and personally led the fire attack as it blasted its way through the enemy ring. As they came to a hairpin curve, enemy fire from the roadblock again pinned the column down. Lieutenant Colonel Faith organized a group of men and directed their attack on the enemy positions on the right flank. He then placed himself at the head of another group of men, and in the face of direct enemy fire led an attack on the enemy roadblock, firing his pistol and throwing grenades. When he had reached a position approximately 30 yards from the roadblock, he was mortally wounded, but continued to direct the attack until the roadblock was overrun. Throughout the 5 days of action, Lieutenant Colonel Faith gave no thought to his safety and did not spare himself. His presence each time in the position of greatest danger was an inspiration to his men. Also, the damage he personally inflicted, firing from his position at the head of his men, was a material assistance on several occasions. Lieutenant Colonel Faith's outstanding gallantry and noble self-sacrifice above and beyond the call of duty reflect the highest honor on him and are in keeping with the highest traditions of the U.S. Army." End quote. I've gone into a lot of detail about the plight of Task Force Faith and the soldiers east of Chosin Reservoir because this account is so gripping. You can see a unit subjected to blow after blow from the enemy in freezing weather and horrible conditions, but they keep on fighting, day after day. However, eventually, the unit becomes so stressed and damaged that cohesion starts to fall apart, and eventually, everything falls apart. This account also has great personal significance to me, as the first book I read on Task Force Faith, a book called east of Chosin, by Roy Appleman, I read while in the middle of a freezing cold Korean winter, living out of a tent at a gunnery range called Chippery. I could vividly imagine how much worse the conditions for Task Force Faith was compared to ours, and I wanted to learn all I could about what had happened in those frigid tracks in the mountains of North Korea, and how that would apply to my time serving as a staff officer and later a commander during my tour. The sacrifice of Task Force Faith did have a silver lining. They tied up significant Chinese combat power on the east side of the reservoir. That Chinese division was supposed to be attacking the main perimeter of Hagururi. If those Chinese had launched the attack on the main perimeter that first night of the 27th of November, before Task Force Drysdale's reinforcements or Captain Drake's tank company had made it to Hagururi, they likely would have seized Hagururi, collapsed the Marine positions, and doomed the 1st Marine Division. The division command post would have been overrun, as well as the partially completed airstrip, and the Marines at Udamni would have been forced to advance over 20 miles without help to reach Kotori. As it was, though, the actions of Udamni, Hagururi, and east of Chosin took a heavy toll on the Chinese. The Chinese had suffered thousands of casualties, with 4 divisions being effectively gutted. Aside from the destruction of Task Force Faith, the Chinese in subsequent days stopped trying to launch major attacks on the perimeters, instead trying to play the long game by obstructing the roads and keeping the Marines isolated from resupply or reinforcement. However, even this danger was mitigated somewhat by the opening of the Hagururi airstrip. On December 1st, General Smith authorized a trial landing at the airstrip, even though it was still a few hundred feet short of what a C-47 is supposed to require. The first plane lands successfully at 14:30 hours, taking off half an hour later with 24 wounded on board. 3 more planes land during the day, though one of them, heavily loaded with ammunition, breaks its landing gear on the rough ground and has to be destroyed after they unload the cargo. But on 2nd December, some 914 casualties were flown out, and on subsequent days, about 1,000 a day are flown out. Air landing supplies is a far more effective way of delivering them, and evacuating the wounded on their flight back greatly eases the logistic challenges both in terms of sustainment, but also in the breakout as well. While this is going on, the Marines break out from Udamni and begin fighting their way back to Hagururi. General Smith had ordered the Marines there to break out as far back as 29 November, but the offensive is delayed until the 1st to give time for the perimeter to stabilize from the Chinese attacks and to adequately plan and resource their advance. Their objective is a hard one, to traverse the 14-mile road through the mountains and Toktong Pass against an entire Chinese division, the 59th, which was blocking the way. The plan is for the 2 Marine infantry regiments to attack and seize the high ground on either side of the road, enabling the vehicles to pass through. The breakout is planned to begin at daylight on the 1st of December. Some 26 provisional rifle platoons are formed from artillerymen, headquarters personnel, and the service troops. They take out their wounded, but there's not enough room to carry the dead, so the Marines conduct a field burial service for 85 personnel on December 1st, and then move out from Udamni. This is a deliberate attack along the road. The vehicle column only proceeds when the high ground has been cleared, and this is achievable due to the combat power available to the Marines, something that Task Force Faith, with only 2 weakened battalions, did not have. Only the wounded and the drivers are in the vehicles. Everyone else is fighting and marching on foot. The 155mm howitzers and their tractors are at the tail end of the column out of fears that, if they are knocked out, the tractor will block the road. To support this breakout, the Marines have 280 aircraft available for support. The rear guard, comprised of 2 battalions, disengage from their positions in the hills around Udamni. The Chinese stay in their foxholes thanks to numerous aircraft attacking the Chinese positions around them, but the way ahead is difficult, for the road proceeds through a valley with high ground rising some 700 feet on each side. The valley floor is at most a few hundred feet wide, and then the road turns east into the mountains to get to the Toktong Pass. The initial hilltops overlooking the road prove to be tough positions to seize. Initially, the Marines start with company-sized attacks, but the forces involved escalate throughout the day until whole battalions are committed. Hill 1542 on the west side of the road finally falls around 2100 hours. Another battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Taplett, attacks to seize Hill 1520 on the east side of the road. I Company runs into a large, dug-in Chinese force, and the Chinese counterattack, isolating the company from the rest of the battalion and wounding the company commander. A second lieutenant takes command, and the Chinese seem about to overrun the perimeter when a platoon sergeant, Staff Sergeant William Windrick, organizes a squad to counterattack. He and the majority of his squad are wounded by Chinese grenades, but he continues to fight, later organizing casualty evacuation where he is wounded a second time. He refuses to have his wounds treated, saying, quote, "There isn't time. They're only small holes anyway," end quote. And he eventually collapses from blood loss, pain, and exhaustion near the end of the fight, dying and earning the Congressional Medal of Honor. I Company is down to 20 able-bodied men by dawn, but there are some 342 dead Chinese around their positions. The battalion attack on Hill 1520 continues in the morning, seizing the crest by noon. While the vehicle column is waiting for the road to be cleared, the Chinese close with and attack the rear guard in the night. There are a few Marine night fighter aircraft on station to assist, and the Chinese fail to breach the perimeter, or, in the cases where they do seize a foothold, the Marines vigorously counterattack them and push them back. The Chinese suffer several hundred more casualties in the fighting. The Marines take losses of their own too, but they manage to keep the Chinese far enough away from the vehicles to protect them from small arms fire. The column advances, but is stopped again at a blown bridge, and the engineers are called forward to construct a bypass, while 12 Corsairs hit Chinese machine gun positions around the crossing site. Lieutenant Colonel Taplett's battalion resumes the advance and halts at 0200 on 3rd December, exhausted, a half a mile from the top of Toktung Pass and Fox Company's positions. Snow falls, and the advance resumes in the morning through 6 inches of snow. This attack is led by the lone M26 tank that had made it to Udamni before the roads were closed. Now, for its part, Fox Company had endured relentless attacks in the preceding days. One night, a Chinese soldier called out in English, telling the Marines that they were surrounded and if they surrender, they'll be treated well. The Marines respond with small arms fire and then decimate the following Chinese attack with artillery and machine guns. The night of 30 November to 1st December, the Chinese occupy positions on what would be known as Rocky Ridge, a ridgeline overlooking Captain Barber's company. Chinese from the ridgeline began firing on Fox Company, and in response, the Fox Company forward observer, Lieutenant Campbell, calls an artillery fire and times mortar illumination rounds so he can spot the fall of the shot and correct it. The first rounds are on target, though, wiping out the enemy machine guns. Now, the Marines hadn't forgotten about Fox Company, and indeed they dedicated a whole battalion, 1st Battalion 7th Marines, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis, with the sole mission of relieving Fox Company. Davis's battalion avoids the roads entirely and marches over the hills, carrying extra ammunition, litters, sleeping bags, and a few machine guns and mortars. Their goal is to avoid major engagements and infiltrate through the Chinese lines to link up with Fox Company. They set off after dark on December 1st, and as they march, temperatures drop to 16 below zero, adding the risk of frostbite from frozen sweat as they stop moving. They advance for hours without opposition, only encountering the weather and challenging terrain. They navigate by dead reckoning, and the point man, though, starts drifting further south than originally intended, and they actually end up on the east side of Hill 1520, the same hill Lieutenant Colonel Taplett's men were attacking from the west. They run into Chinese troops positioned there, but catch them by surprise, overrunning a whole platoon with minimal casualties. The men lie down to rest, but the NCOs and officers rouse them and get them going again, continuing to march until 0300 on the 2nd of December. They make radio contact with Fox Company in the morning, and they seize Rocky Ridge during the daylight hours, linking up with Fox Company at 11:25 on the 2nd of December. They consolidate, reorganize, and spend a quiet night at Toktung Pass. The following day, his men link up with Lieutenant Colonel Taplett's battalion advancing along the road. Both Captain Barber and Lieutenant Colonel Davis are awarded Congressional Medals of Honor for their roles in defending Toktung Pass and in leading the overland march to relieve Fox Company. Since Lieutenant Colonel Davis's battalion is much fresher than Colonel Taplett's, his men take over the point position in advancing to Hagaruri, with the lone tank leading the way. Fox Company remains in position due to their casualties until the vehicle column arrives later in the day to help transport them. Thanks to copious air support, artillery support, and the harsh weather, the Marines encounter no serious delays for the rest of their march to Hagururi. The Chinese troops have suffered severely in the cold weather, particularly from a lack of gloves or winter footwear, and some Marines captured Chinese soldiers that were so cold that they abandoned their weapons and were huddled together for warmth. The only hiccup in the withdrawal happens at 0200 on the 4th of December, when the prime movers hauling the 155 howitzers run out of gas east of Toktong Pass. You see, the tractors ran on diesel fuel, and the gas that was airdropped was regular gasoline, which the trucks used. While the rear guard consolidates around these vehicles to protect them from the gathering Chinese forces, the enemy blows up a small bridge ahead of the column, causing some of the truck drivers to panic and try to drive off the road over the icy stream. Officers pursued the trucks to rally them and restore calm, and in the pause some of the towed 105 howitzers are unlimbered and used in direct fire against the Chinese. When day comes, the Chinese fire block is wiped out with the help of air and artillery support, and the column moves on, though they have to abandon the 155 howitzers and prime movers. They end up calling in an airstrike to destroy the vehicles and prevent their capture. The last Marines arrived from Udamni around 1500 on the 4th of December, averaging about 5.5 hours per mile to reach Hagururi. They bring some 1,500 casualties with them, which are then evacuated out of the airfield. Indeed, some 537 additional Marines are flown in on the C-47s, and General Smith gathers his forces to advance south to Kotori, with the planned start on 6th of December to allow his troops to rest and to fly out his remaining wounded. It's 11 miles by road from Hagururi to Kotori. As with the breakout from Udamni, the Marines planned this as a fighting attack southward, led by the 7th Marine Regiment, then the headquarters and artillery, and finally closed by the 5th Marine Regiment. The vehicle column will only advance when the high ground has been taken, and everyone walks except for drivers, radio operators, and the wounded. This maximizes the amount of protection available to the convoy. Broken down vehicles will be moved to the side of the road, and, if unable to repair them, they will be destroyed by the rear guard. Now, to get a sense of the scale of this force moving out, the Marines have some 14,000 troops in the column and 1,200 vehicles. The division is led by a platoon of tanks, and the survivors of the Task Force Faith and the 31st Regimental Combat Team have been formed into 2 provisional battalions fighting under the regimental headquarters. There are elements of 7 Chinese divisions arrayed along the withdrawal route, although many of them have been worn down significantly by the fighting and the weather. There are, however, 2 fresh divisions that had just arrived from Manchuria, and 2 more are on the way. The Marines' attack begins at 0445 hours, and it takes several hours for the Marines to clear the initial Chinese positions along the road just outside Hagururi. Then, after clearing it, they run into another position a few miles further south. In general, these Chinese fire blocks delay the column, but are unable to inflict significant casualties on the Americans. The deliberate nature of the attack, accompanied by copious airstrikes and mortar fire, chews up the Chinese and dislodges them position by position. One company even captures 115 soldiers without losing a single soldier of their own. By noon, the vehicle convoy is cleared to begin moving, though repeated Chinese positions along the line make progress slow. The convoy only makes it 3 hours before nightfall. However, the Marines know that Chinese reinforcements are en route, and so they push on through the night. They even see, in the evening skies, Chinese troops silhouetted against the hills to their east, moving south in spite of airstrikes and artillery fire. Temperatures plummet that night to 20 below zero, and there are several inches of snow on the ground. By 2200 hours, the column has advanced 5 miles, but an enemy machine gun position delays them for 2 more hours. Then they encounter a destroyed bridge, requiring the engineers to come forward and bridge the gap. A second destroyed bridge is found beyond it, this one requiring a bulldozer to cut a bypass. And then, when the column is halted, the Chinese attack it, inflicting casualties on the 7th Marine Regiment headquarters and wounding some of the staff. Another attack makes it to within grenade range of a battalion headquarters. Nevertheless, the Marines fight on and push the Chinese back, and they continue to advance past the destroyed and knocked out vehicles in Hellfire Valley and beyond it to Kotori. The first elements of the Marines make it to Kotori at 0530 on the 7th of December, although it still takes the rest of the day for the division to make it. After the 7th Marines cleared out the Chinese, many of them reformed and reoccupied positions by the time the vehicle column arrives. The headquarters personnel fight as infantry, and the howitzers at times have to deploy from their trucks and engage in direct fire, sometimes as close as 40 yards from the enemy. This brutal rifle and melee fight at close range is intense. In one assault, a First Lieutenant Charles Sullivan empties his carbine into the Chinese and then hurls his weapon, bayonet fixed, like a javelin, killing another Chinese soldier 15 feet away. The headquarters column makes it to Coterie at 10 o'clock in the morning. The 5th Marines and the rear guard are hit throughout the night, but with the help of Captain Drake's Sherman tanks and ample fire support, they also make it through the night, starting to arrive at Coterie at 1700, with the whole column closing in by midnight. Throughout the fight, 3 aircraft carriers are offshore, sending 216 sorties during the 10 hours of daylight available. Some of them provide direct support to the fighting, and others striking houses and villages where the Chinese soldiers take shelter during the day. The last leg of the breakout is from Coterie, down the narrow road and the Funchalen Pass, to the Marine Battalion stationed at Chihung-ni, and beyond that, to the port of Hungnam, where all of 10th Corps is gathering. While the 1st Marine Division has been fighting for their life at Chosin, the other elements of 10th Corps are consolidating around the port of Hungnam. The ROK 1st Corps withdraws from the northeast corner of Korea as fast as they had arrived, some even evacuated on Navy ships back to Hungnam. The 7th Infantry Division makes it to the Yalu River, the only U.S. Army organization to make it there, but shortly thereafter turns around, and the 3rd Infantry Division leaves Wonsan and consolidates at the perimeter around Hungnam as well. Throughout this consolidation, there is little to no enemy opposition. The Chinese are fighting in strength at Chosin, but nowhere else in the 10th Corps sector. However, MacArthur knows that the strategic situation has changed and that the Corps shouldn't remain dispersed across North Korea while still expecting to survive. The way out from Coterie is an 8-mile road that descends some 3,500 feet. The key terrain along the route is Hill 1081, halfway along the route and overlooking a hairpin curve on the narrow single-lane road. Half a mile west from that point is another critical piece of terrain. There is a gatehouse there along the side of a cliff at Funchalen Pass. This gatehouse is part of the hydroelectric power plant located there, where water flows by river from the Chosin Reservoir to this cliff, goes down pipes through the gatehouse, and further down several hundred feet below to the actual hydroelectric turbines. There is no bypass to the road, because above it is a steep cliff face, below it is a cliff face, and so if the Chinese are able to destroy this bridge and keep it destroyed, the Marines will have no way to get any of their vehicles back from Coterie. 2 Chinese divisions are freshly arrived from Manchuria. They arrived too late to see fighting in the earlier battles, but they finally made it here with the forced march. Every bridge along the route's been blown, and the Chinese have built bunkers along the route overlooking the road. A 3rd Chinese division had been surrounding Coterie since the 5th of December, but airstrikes and artillery attacks on their assembly areas prevented them from making any major attack on the perimeter and inflicted heavy casualties on the Chinese. Moreover, about half of the Chinese casualties are coming not from direct combat, but from the harsh weather conditions, either frostbite or trench foot, compounded by meager rations. To fight at peak efficiency, these troops, especially the light infantry, should be consuming far more calories than normal due to the cold weather and challenging terrain. The Marine plan employs the now familiar tactics of leading with infantry to seize the high ground and then letting the vehicles pass through. However, they're also committing a Marine battalion to attack from the east, up the Funchalen Pass from Chihung-ni, towards Hill 1081. This is possible because a battalion from the 3rd Infantry Division, Task Force Dog, is moved up to secure Chihung-ni, freeing the Marine battalion to attack west. This battalion attacks on the 8th of December at 0200 in the middle of a snowstorm. This gives the Marines the element of surprise, both in their route of advance, as the Chinese aren't expecting this attack from the east, but also allowing them to approach the Chinese positions virtually undetected thanks to the snowstorm. They seize several roadblocks with little effort, though when the Chinese do resist, the fighting is brief, violent, and at close quarters with little opportunity for maneuver. One soldier who fought on Hill 1081 said, quote, "Some of these ice-covered ridges were so treacherous that when a rifle company attacked, it was a squad from the leading platoon that went along the only avenue of approach, the well-beaten path along the ridgeline. Why? because the Rocky Mountain goat could not have scaled the slippery sides of these rocky ridges without falling. Sure, the enemy had this path zeroed in, but when there was only one approach, the rifle squad had to use it, with the remainder of the company charging along in column behind. This attack seizes several key positions on Hill 1081 with low casualties, though the Chinese retained control of the military crest of the hill. The Marines breaking out from Coterie are also attacking in the same snowstorm, and this makes close air support impossible and slows vehicle movement. The tanks are positioned at the rear of the column out of concerns that if one of them gets knocked out or stalls, it would block the road for everyone else. In the course of the day, the column only advances 2 miles, and the weather is very cold, 10 below zero. The most significant obstacle to their withdrawal is the blown bridge at the gatehouse at Funchalen Pass. A 16-foot gap has been blown in the road, and, being on the side of a cliff, there's no bypass. When it was first destroyed on the 5th of December, the engineers built a wooden bridge to replace it, but the Chinese then destroyed that bridge as well. Then the engineers emplaced a steel treadway bridge, that is, 2 curved metal beams for the tires of vehicles to travel on, but the Chinese destroyed that one as well. So to tackle this problem, General Smith requested 4 M2 treadway bridge sections to span the gap. Each one spans an 18-foot gap and weighs 2,900 pounds. The Marines are also fortunate enough to have a bridging platoon with 4 trucks equipped to handle, join, and emplace treadway bridges. The only problem is to get the bridge sections to them, they have to be airdropped, something that had never been done before. They tested out doing an experimental drop near Wonsan, and the initial testing fails miserably. The bridge section crumpled on impact and buried itself up to 20 feet deep in the terrain. However, they find larger parachutes in Japan and bring them in, dropping 8 sections in a small drop zone out of concerns that half would get damaged or destroyed. 6 of the 8 are recovered intact. When the Marines reach the gatehouse, they find nearly 50 Chinese soldiers there in their foxholes, but the Chinese offer no resistance. The Marines find that the Chinese soldiers are nearly frozen stiff due to exposure from the frigid weather. Many of them have to be physically picked up out of their foxholes, and some of their hands are literally frozen to their weapons. These Chinese soldiers had been rushed south during the snowstorm to occupy the defensive positions, but having sweated in the movement and then sat still on their arrival, they suffered many cold weather casualties, and some even froze to death in their own sweat. To bridge the gap, the engineers have to rebuild one of the abutments of the crossing site with sandbags and timbers, but by evening on the second night, the bridge is in place and the first vehicles begin to cross. That same night, lead elements from the 7th Marines link up with the battalion on Hill 1081, clearing the Chinese from their positions through a combination of flanking attacks, hand grenades, and copious fire support. The only Chinese attack of significance on the column hits the rear guard near Kotori in battalion-sized force. But once again, the superior firepower of the Marines disperse the attack and drive them off. The rear guard departs Kotori, along with General Smith, on the 10th of December, and the 1st Marines began to arrive at Chihongni. Lieutenant Colonel Alvin Newberry, XO of the 3rd Infantry Division's Task Force Dog, recalled, quote, "All day they marched through, both foot and motor elements moving at the 2-mile-an-hour pace of Atlee trailers and the dog-tired riflemen. Every inch of the train was covered with materiel or men, including many casualties. Trains were well organized, and those fortunate enough to have escaped frostbite, but not lucky enough to have caught a ride, were still carrying all their equipment. They were weary to exhaustion, but they were intact, proud, and fit to fight." End quote. There are only 2 hiccups on the withdrawal. The first is the Chinese ambush of forces between Chihongni and Hangnum, where the Chinese managed to infiltrate some 50 soldiers into a village and ambush part of the 1st Marine trains as they passed through. The forward elements of the Marines had already passed through the area, so there are no infantrymen present when the Chinese burst out of the huts, firing burp guns and throwing grenades. They knock out several trucks, but the logisticians fought back, and a nearby artillery officer, Lieutenant Colonel John Page, along with 2 Marines, see the fight break out and charge the enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Page died in the assault, later found amongst a heap of 16 dead Chinese soldiers, and the counterattack that he led broke up the Chinese momentum, enabling movement to resume. Lieutenant Colonel Page earned the Navy Cross, the highest Marine award, and eventually in 1957 he was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. The other incident happened at the tail of the column, where there are 40 tanks without infantry support. One of the tanks had their brakes lock up, separating the rear 9 tanks from the rest of the column. There was a large mass of Korean refugees following the column, interspersed with Chinese soldiers, and while the column was stopped, the Chinese soldiers attacked it, setting the rear tank ablaze. 5 other crews abandoned their tanks in the ensuing fight, although the remaining 4 managed to rejoin the column. In all, the 1st Marine Division completed their withdrawal from Coterie, suffering only 75 killed, 16 missing, and 256 wounded in action. The final act in the drama of the 10th Corps North Korea was the withdrawal from Hungnam. There are 5 divisions now concentrated around the port, and General Alman determined that this would be a deliberate withdrawal, evacuating as much materiel and supplies as possible. General Almond and his staff develop a series of phased withdrawal lines to shrink the perimeter as forces are evacuated, and these are augmented by extensive air and naval firepower. In reality, there was no way the Chinese could have hoped to take Hungnam by force. With complete air and naval dominance, UN forces could have actually kept 10th Corps at Hungnam supplied indefinitely, if they wanted to. The Chinese conduct some probing attacks on the perimeter on the 13th and 14th of December, but they don't launch a major attack until the 15th, when they hit the 3rd Infantry Division on the north side of the perimeter. They attack in battalion strength and manage to surround some platoons and forward outposts, but the soldiers hold the line, employ their superior firepower against the Chinese, and counterattack in the daytime to restore their front lines and relieve the surrounded elements. The Chinese assemble 4 divisions, some 23,000 troops, around the perimeter and make attempts to break in, but are rebuffed time and time again. After the 19th of December, the Chinese abandoned their attacks due to heavy casualties. Indeed, the UN forces are expending between 5,000 and 10,000 rounds of artillery per day in the 3ID sector alone. Navy cruisers and even the battleship Missouri, with its 16-inch guns, bombard the Chinese positions. Navy transports come and go from Hungnam, evacuating 105,000 troops, 17,500 vehicles, 350,000 tons of cargo, and 98,000 refugees. And of note with these refugees, as has been typical throughout the Korean War, these civilians are desperate to escape from the communist regime. They've abandoned their homes and their livelihoods in the middle of a very, very cold winter, carrying all they own on their backs. When the main roads are blocked by military checkpoints, they choose to make their way through minefields to get to safety. There's limited space available on the ships for the refugees, and they crowd on as tight as possible. One Liberty ship had 14,000 refugees on board. Another landing ship tank had some 10,000. So many men and women that every space is filled, standing room only, with no room below decks to retire to in the cold weather. These civilians endured freezing weather for days on their journey south. In all, only about 1,000 tons of supplies have to be abandoned or destroyed, including some frozen TNT that's too dangerous to handle. But everything of use was evacuated, even some 400 unserviceable vehicles. This was not a Dunkirk-style evacuation under heavy enemy pressure, but a planned, deliberate withdrawal that the communists were unable to significantly interfere with. In retrospect, the Chinese forces were mauled in their efforts to annihilate the 1st Infantry Division. The 9th Army Group was out of commission for months to take on replacements and reconstitute its forces. These forces that fought at Chosin would not be seen again on the front line until April 1951. These devastating losses were in part the plight of a lightly armed infantry force attacking an enemy with overwhelming air and artillery firepower, combined with the logistic strength to sustain those forces in combat over an extended period of time. In contrast, the Chinese suffered from a lack of cold weather gear, especially for their hands and feet, poor to non-existent medical facilities, and harsh weather. These Chinese soldiers did not come from Manchuria, but mostly from southern China, so they didn't have much knowledge on how to operate in cold climates safely. Not only that, but the Chinese didn't have the logistics support to sustain their forces in combat for long, especially over long distances. For most of the Chinese soldiers, there was no resupply. They had to live off the land and capture whatever they could. American estimates are that, out of the 72,000 Chinese soldiers engaged in fighting around the Chosin Reservoir, about 55,000 became casualties, half of them from combat and the other half due to the weather. The biggest chance for a Chinese success would have been at the opening salvo of the counterattack. If they had hit Hakururi in force with 2 divisions that first night, they likely would have overwhelmed the thin perimeter. But the southern attack was delayed till the following night, and even then made only with a single regiment, while the northern attack was delayed even longer because they were busy destroying Task Force Faith. The lack of effective long-range communications hindered the Chinese ability to coordinate their forces and made them slow to react to changes. One of the critical lessons for the 10th Corps' success in escaping the Chinese trap comes in large part from steadfast leadership at all echelons. When surrounded, there was no panicked desire to retreat or break contact from the enemy. Even Task Force Faith, which was annihilated, still fought on for 5 days in atrocious conditions before collapsing. General Smith realized the importance of establishing resupply and building airstrips at Hakururi and Kotori, and then deliberately fighting his way out in clearing the hills and then advancing along the roads. General Alman chose to conduct the deliberate withdrawal from Hungnam instead of abandoning or destroying the hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies accumulated ashore. This stands in stark contrast to the 8th Army's wholesale abandoning North Korea and blowing up supplies left and right following the 2nd Infantry Division decimation at the Gauntlet. One can only imagine how the course of the war would have changed if the 8th Army conducted a deliberate, phased withdrawal, bleeding the Chinese dry every step of the way. Sure, they still would have lost a lot of ground, but the war would likely have ended far north of the 38th parallel, perhaps even retaining control of Pyongyang, and this in turn would have crippled the surviving North Korean state and made the current North Korean antics with their nuclear and missile programs virtually impossible. However, that's not what happened. And in truth, we have the benefit of hindsight. We know the limitations of the Chinese force in logistics support compared to the American side, whereas many of the leaders on the ground fighting it out were suddenly confronted with a large force they had never fought with before, making surprising advances or capabilities they had not expected. As it would be, the Chinese troops advanced south past Pyongyang to the UN lines on the 38th parallel, and there are 2.5 more years of hard fighting until the war is finally concluded. We'll discuss all that and more on the next episode of the Wheels of History podcast. If you know anyone out there who might be interested, please share the podcast with them. And if you've enjoyed this series, please support the Wheels of History podcast. You can support us on Patreon. For just $5, less than the cost of a Subway sandwich, you can gain access to a bonus episode covering more details on the sources I've researched for the series and my experiences being stationed in Korea. Thank you very much, have a great day, and I'll see you next time on the Wheels of History podcast.